Now turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 8. And in a minute, I'm going to read verses 18 through 22, and that's going to be where our lesson's coming from. But you may remember as we started our series in the book of Matthew that I wanted to talk about the purpose of the book of Matthew, working through the book of Matthew and what we're trying to accomplish. And the very first one is to come to understand why Jesus is so worthy of our life and worship and what discipleship looks like. And guess what? In today's lesson, we're specifically going to be addressing what discipleship looks like. So follow along and I'll read Matthew 8, 18 through 22. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." This paragraph is on discipleship. What does it mean to follow Jesus? And as we look at this, Jesus, again, is interacting with the crowds. All through the book of Matthew, we find the crowds being many times the context in which Jesus will either instruct. Remember last week we talked about how to look at Jesus' ministry. There was teaching, there was proclaiming, there was healing, and there was compassion, demonstrations of compassion. Well, what we're going to find here is a lot of teaching and instruction going on in this paragraph. So Jesus is interacting with the crowd. And he gave orders to his disciples to cross over the other side on the Lake of Galilee. And notice what sort of motivated that. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Sometimes the press, and you'll see this all through different places in Jesus' ministry, the press of the crowd kept him from perhaps doing what he wanted to do at the moment. And he would either get in a boat, speak to the crowd, or sometimes here he would tell his disciples, "Let's get in the boat and let's go over to the other side." And it's almost like, wow. And you wonder what else could have gone on. But apparently before he takes off, two people come to him. And we're going to talk about these two individuals. Jesus, they approach Jesus, presumably as he's entering a boat with his disciples, and they want to follow Jesus. And it raises a clear, fundamental question that we have to ask today. What does it mean to follow Jesus? And we'll get some insight into that. We're going to look at Jesus' response to these two individuals. And this vignette or episode in Matthew is crucial to our understanding what's at the core of committed discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, and what does it mean to stay committed to him? Well, let's look first of all at the cost of following Jesus. This teacher of the law, who is a scribe, comes to Jesus and addresses him as teacher. Now, it's interesting. Some have suggested that this was not one of the followers and disciples of Jesus at this point. And we'll talk about that in a moment when we look at the other guy. But he's a scribe, he's a teacher. And because of the way he words this, some people think that this individual was sharp enough to recognize that in the disciples that Jesus had gathered, nobody was a scribe or a teacher of the law. And he may have felt, well, Jesus, in order for your group to really be filled out with the kind of people you need as a rabbi, let me come in as a follower of yours, because I'm a scribe. Some people think he may have been thinking like, I know a lot of stuff you need to know, so please let me in your group. And there may be a hint of pride in his asking to be a disciple. But it raises the question, what is a disciple? It's a word that's used all through our Gospels. A disciple fundamentally is a learner and a follower. You learn about a particular person and their teachings, and you commit yourself to being a follower. And because of this gentleman, he did say, I will follow you. This idea of being a disciple is really crucial in Matthew's picture of Jesus and what Jesus is looking for. In fact, I didn't know this till this past week as far as the specifics. The word disciple is used 72 times in Matthew. And I felt like you probably didn't want to sit here and work through all 72 times because we want to have lunch. So I'm just going to refer to just a couple that's representative in Matthew of what a disciple is. Matthew 4:18, we learned earlier, Jesus calls his first disciples. In Matthew 9, 10, and 11, he talks about who the disciples associate with and who they follow. And then in chapter 10, 42, whoever gives one of these little ones a cup of cold water because he is a disciple, truly I say to you, he will by no means lose his reward. That's a significant insight because we don't just learn about Jesus, we don't just commit ourselves to him, but we also act. We do what a disciple does. And that's the interesting thing as we ourselves individually and as a church, when we are looking at what it means to be a faithful disciple, we want to know who Jesus is. We want to know what his teachings are. We want to be committed to that, but we also want to do that, which we need to do. In Matthew 12:49, and I think this sort of surprised the crowd. And again, in Matthew 12:49, he's interacting with the crowd. The crowd comes to him and said, Jesus, your mother, your father, your family, they want to talk to you. So apparently they're kind of out on the fringe of the crowd. And here was Jesus' response. He stretched out his hand toward his disciples and he said, here's my mother and my brothers. Now, they must have been shocked at that, I guess, because instead of recognizing, oh, okay, come on in, folks. This is my family. I want to introduce you to them. He didn't do that. Pointed to the disciples, that's my family. And then in Matthew 28:19, which is right near the very end of chapter 28 of the book of Matthew, do you realize that part of the Great Commission, go therefore and make disciples. Disciples make disciples. That's interesting, isn't it? Because it's the idea that we want God's family to grow. We want the kingdom to spread. We want the church to have an impact in the world. So all of us, at whatever level we can and how we're gifted, and the church together, we're all disciple makers. Disciples make disciples. Now, this teacher that came to Jesus, he used the word follow. I want to follow you. I will follow you. I find it fascinating that in the Gospels, that discipleship is presented in terms of following. And in the ancient world which Jesus lived, it was literally the case, literally, because Jesus, kind of the way he dealt with his disciples, it looks like he took on the model of how a rabbi would teach his disciples, but they literally would walk around and the disciples would follow them. Probably the best example that I can think of today, this is one that always comes to my mind. If you're aware of when a doctor is in a hospital and it's a teaching hospital and he has a whole group of interns around him, and he'll take them into a patient's room, ask them what did they see, he'll ask questions, he'll answer it if they get it all wrong. So in other words, he is sort of the instructor and the teacher, and they're the disciples following him around from room to room. That's kind of our modern example. But literally, I will follow you. So he was willing, it sounds like. He expressed his willingness. And it is interesting that in the idea of discipleship in the Gospels, there has to be our voluntary will to follow Jesus. I can't make anybody follow Jesus. That's why historically, when you study the history of Christianity, there's some of it that went off the rails. I hate to say it. But when we talk about like Christian crusades historically, that was started off on the wrong foot to begin with. You don't take a sword to convert people. I'm sorry. That's not how Jesus viewed it. He even told his disciples, put up your sword. So, no, it's voluntary will. It is my choice. I want to follow you. He doesn't make me. You don't make me. That's my decision. It has to be personal. This is the language of discipleship. I will follow you. Sounds good, because if it's taken at face value and the person voluntarily chooses, it emphasizes the element of trust. Lord, I trust you where you're going to take me. This disciple expressed that willingness, and it is a trust in where he's going to take us. Now, don't overlook this. He said, wherever you go. I don't think he understood what he meant by that, but he said it. Wherever you go, I'm ready to go. Jesus' response is rather interesting, because even though he was willing to give up his ideas where he thought he ought to go if he's going to follow Jesus, it takes a lot of courage to say wherever. It does. Nancy may have been surprised with our vacation plans this week. I told her, I said, wherever. And when you say wherever, guess what you're doing? You're giving up your own personal choice, and you're letting the other person make a decision. Wherever. Okay? Jesus, I'm surprised at Jesus' answer. Maybe you are too. This sounds so good that you would think that Jesus would have responded with something like, well, he did respond earlier. Remember when the centurion's servant was healed? He said, man, I haven't found this kind of faith in Israel. Maybe he could have said here, oh, teacher and scribe, thank you. This is what I've been looking for. He doesn't say that. Look at what he says. Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He says, wherever you go, Jesus goes, I don't have a wherever. I don't have a place I'm going to. I don't have a place to lay my head. And because he answers that, he knows that animals have a place to call home. But the necessity of Jesus' ministry didn't really allow him to have a place where he called home, though it sounds like Peter and other disciples opened up their homes as places for him to stay for hospitality. And I hear what's the word I want to use? I hear the question he doesn't verbalize. You can hear Jesus really trying to say, are you sure you want to follow me? Are you sure? And it then moves into the priority of following Jesus, and another disciple comes. This is interesting because it raises all sorts of questions. When the scribe came up, literally it says, one scribe came to Jesus. And it's almost as if it's setting that scribe kind of up to look at and examine, because none of the other scribes did. This one scribe came to Jesus. Here, he's talking about another disciple. What we don't know is if it refers to the scribe being considered kind of a disciple, or if it's another disciple that followed Jesus out of the group of disciples. So, and depending on which book you pick up, they'll give you either option. But the fascinating thing is, I think even the scribe that came to Jesus saw himself, and we'll talk about this, at some level, he thought he wanted to be a learner and a follower of Jesus. Well, another disciple comes up, and this disciple makes us realize there's a wide variety of disciples in the book of Matthew. People follow Jesus for different reasons, not only during his ministry, but even today. People will latch onto the church, people will latch onto the kingdom for their own personal motivations that may not be the best. But discipleship comes at different levels. It's interesting to see the wide variety of that in the book of Matthew. We come to understand that at a fundamental level, a disciple is somebody that wants to learn about Jesus. But learning, first of all, comes at a cost. He said, I don't have anywhere to lay my head. Are you sure? Have you counted the cost? But then the second is it's a commitment. And notice that the learning of Jesus is on a broad continuum. On the one hand, it's a person being forced to be a disciple, that well, they're not really a disciple. But then on the other hand, is total self-motivation and desire. That Jesus is looking for the person that wants to go all in and say yes. Now, this person, this other disciple, he says, well, I need to go and bury my father first. Sounds to me like it's a legitimate request. In Jewish practice, they were supposed to be buried, I think, within, actually before the sunset of that day. So it sounds like it's a legitimate request. But this represents individuals desiring to be a disciple, but they want to get things in order first. And I've heard people tell me this through the years. I know I need to be a Christian. I'd like to be, but let me get my house in order first. Is that going to happen? Probably not. Is that how the Lord calls you to discipleship? Definitely no. You don't get your house in order before you come to the Lord. Wow. Well, seems like, and burying one's father would represent a priority, but not the highest. And when Jesus gives this answer, some people have said, well, he was just insensitive here. I don't think so. But the image is quite shocking. And I found an image to put up here, but he uses an expression that kind of jolts you. Well, let the dead bury their own dead, their own dead. Well, how do the dead bury the dead? Well, they don't. Can't do it that way. But Jesus is saying you've got a choice you have to make. And it's really an application of Matthew 6:33. Turn back to the earlier chapter of Matthew 6. And we went over this about seeking first the kingdom. And this was in the context of living the kind of life that doesn't worry, you're not filled with anxiety, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. And all these things will be given to you as well. It is the attitude of seeking first the kingdom, not some other priority down the list. Very important. There are so many other passages in Matthew that underscore getting your priorities right, following Jesus. I just want to share three. And when I share these, they're ones that you're familiar with, but boy, do they highlight priority. Matthew 10:37 through 39. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Strong words of first priority commitment. Matthew 16:24 through 26. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for anyone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? choice related to priority. Matthew 19:29. Anyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields, that would be kind of like representation for your business, or fields for my sake, will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. You know, one of the interesting things here that Jesus is saying that we need to hear more often, probably, when we put Jesus as number one priority in life, you're going to come out on the winning side. You're not going to believe how you're going to be blessed. Now, it may be a particular blessing now, down the road, certainly, as Jesus says, in enjoying eternal life. So that when we make that commitment, he is saying loudly and strongly, it is worth every ounce of that commitment to follow Jesus. So then that makes us come to the point of the decision to follow Jesus. The decision to follow Jesus is to his all, what we want to call a response to his all-in calling. We sing the song, I've decided to follow Jesus. It's in our hymn book. We won't sing it, but if you'll turn to it if you want to, I want to point out three key ideas in this song, number 299. And it's a short song. And notice the first thing I want to point out is the refrain, no turning back, no turning back. When we become a disciple of Jesus, you make that commitment for life, and no matter what, you don't turn back. And I will guarantee you that Satan is trying to pull out every tool out of his tool bag to get us to turn back. I've decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. Not going to happen. Number two, though none go with me. Sometimes deciding to follow Jesus is a lonely decision. People, co-workers, family may not appreciate your decision to follow Jesus. Makes no difference. I've decided to follow Jesus. And then in the song it says, my cross I'll carry. It's our responsibility. And we recognize that we do have a responsibility to carry forth the will of Jesus. And yes, there are things we'll have to carry, but he'll carry them with us because he tells us in the book of Matthew, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So beautiful hymn. When we become a Christian, our baptism signals we are all in whatever it takes, and we're not going to turn back. Now, what we don't know, and I wish that we did, what we don't know is both disciples, both of these individuals who talked to Jesus, actually ended up following him or not. If you look at Matthew 8:23, which is, I think, the next paragraph, he gets into the boat and his disciples followed him. Was one or both of these guys some of the people that got in the boat? We don't know. But there is, and I find this fascinating in the Gospel of Matthew, a lot of unfinished stories about potential disciples. And you get the impression, if you read through the Gospel of Matthew and kind of push back a little bit from the table and you start thinking, wow, Jesus met all kinds of people at all places in their journey. Some people really were ready for an all-out, full commitment, no matter what, no turning back. And it really didn't happen until after his resurrection. Because in the Gospel of Matthew, what happens? Even those the closest to him, they scattered. Whenever they were put to the test before his death, they took off. But in the end, look at how they were committed. Notice this is something that is fascinating too to me. There's no application section or teaching section after this, the story of the two people. At the end of this paragraph, Matthew doesn't record a specific command. He doesn't give any application in his interaction with them. But I think he wants the power of the interaction to provide those of us who hear the story and those who originally heard it with the opportunity to think about, okay, where am I In my being a disciple of Jesus, am I like one of these two guys? Or is there a better way to be committed to Jesus? And we assume that when the early church heard and read this section of Matthew's gospel, they would have immediately gotten the point. Because I think when we read it, and we push back from that paragraph and think about it, all kinds of wonderful applications come to our mind, don't they? Got to count the cost. It leaves us then with three questions. Have I counted the cost of following Jesus? And it's not just a one-time commitment, lifetime commitment. Have I counted the cost in making that decision and sticking with it? Is following Jesus the number one priority of my life? Is that my number one priority? And then, am I all in with my decision to follow Jesus? Or as one writer said, am I satisfied with dipping my toe in the stream and just getting a little bit wet because I don't want to go all in? Jesus doesn't want toe dippers. No. All in. So when we think about this lesson, these two individuals, it challenges us at the very fundamental level, asking ourselves, where am I with my own discipleship, learning about following Jesus' teachings and putting them into practice?